Pentagon just issued a warning to Canada that exposed the hidden architecture of modern alliance politics. Washington told Ottawa that choosing Sweden's Gripen fighter jet instead of America's F-35 would come with consequences. NORAD could require restructuring. American fighter operations inside Canadian airspace could increase. Defense cooperation might need recalibration. These weren't suggestions delivered at press conferences. These were private messages passed through diplomatic channels, sharp enough to carry weight, and Canada's response stunned Washington completely. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government made something clear that few U.S. allies ever state so directly. Canada would not outsource its air sovereignty. Canada would not accept procurement decisions shaped by Pentagon pressure. Canada would evaluate fighter aircraft based on Canadian strategic needs, Arctic operational requirements, and national industrial benefits. Not American preference, not alliance politics. Canadian sovereignty, the Pentagon's pressure toolkit, private diplomatic warnings about NORAD restructuring, public statements from U.S. Ambassador Hoekstra suggesting American aircraft would fly more Canadian patrols if Ottawa reduced F-35 purchases, technical arguments about interoperability and intelligence sharing, implications that choosing non-American platforms would complicate coalition operations, economic pressure through tariff threats from President Donald Trump running simultaneously, all designed to lock Canada into F-35 dependency. Carney ordered a complete reassessment of the F-35 contract after projected costs climbed $8 billion over 3 years, reaching roughly $70 billion total. Sweden's Saab offered an alternative. The JES-39 Gripen fighter with local manufacturing, full technology transfer to Canadian industry, 12,600 high-skilled jobs, complete operational control retained by Canada. No American-controlled software pipelines. No U.S. approval required for weapons integration. No dependency on Washington for upgrades. Industry Minister Melanie Joly emphasized that defense spending must strengthen national security while delivering domestic economic benefits. Saab's proposal accomplished both. The F-35 accomplished neither. This isn't a theory, this is happening right now. Sweden's Gripen already flies with NATO members Hungary and Czech Republic, plus close Western partners Brazil and Thailand. It's combat-proven, NATO-compatible, and designed specifically for harsh environments. Yet Pentagon officials reacted as if Canada was abandoning the alliance entirely. Well, why? Because the Gripen represents something Washington cannot tolerate: independence. If Canada can operate modern fighters while retaining full authority over software, mission data, and operational systems, then other allies can too. Finland, Norway, future NATO members. That possibility terrifies Pentagon planners who've built influence through technological dependency. Today, we're showing you how Canada rejected Pentagon pressure over fighter jet procurement and declared full sovereignty over defense decisions, how the Gripen offers capabilities the F-35 cannot match for Arctic operations, how American warnings about NORAD exposed alliance hierarchies built on dependency rather than partnership, and how Canada's refusal to comply quietly is setting a precedent that could reshape NATO power dynamics permanently. This is the story of sovereignty reasserted and alliance politics redefined. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Let's start with what the Pentagon actually said and why Canada's position represents such a fundamental challenge to alliance power structures. This procurement was supposed to be straightforward. Canada would replace its aging CF-18 Hornet fleet, finalize the F-35 purchase that had been discussed for years, and quietly move forward with routine defense modernization. The process was framed as technical bureaucracy wrapped in predictable alliance cooperation. But as Ottawa began evaluating Sweden's Gripen seriously, Pentagon officials stopped speaking in polite diplomatic language and started issuing warnings with consequences attached. U.S. Ambassador Hoekstra stated publicly to CBC News that Canada's plan to buy 88 F-35s directly affects continental defense. If Canada stepped back from that commitment, the United States would step in. He warned that choosing the Gripen would weaken interoperability and force Washington to compensate operationally. American aircraft would need to fly more Canadian patrols. NORAD itself could require restructuring. The implication was unmistakable. Procurement decisions had become leverage. Alliance obligations had become threats. But the Pentagon didn't stop there. Defense insiders confirmed that officials warned Ottawa through private diplomatic channels about intelligence sharing, coalition operations, and NATO integration. These weren't technical discussions about radar compatibility or communication protocols. These were political warnings designed to create pressure. Choose American systems or face strategic consequences. Accept dependency or risk isolation. The message beneath the diplomatic language was brutal. Sovereignty has limits when you're a smaller ally. Mark Carney's response was equally direct. Canada ordered a complete reassessment of the F-35 contract after total program costs climbed to approximately $70 billion, an increase of roughly $8 billion over 3 years. Carney questioned whether that investment aligned with Canada's economic priorities and strategic needs, especially as relations with Washington deteriorated under Donald Trump's tariff threats. Canada would evaluate alternatives. Canada would prioritize Arctic operational requirements. Canada would demand industrial benefits. And Canada would retain full operational control over whatever platform it selected. Swedish Saab offered exactly that package. The Gripen fighter with unit costs significantly lower than F-35. Operating costs roughly 70% less expensive over the aircraft's lifetime. Full technology transfer allowing Canadian industry to manufacture components, perform upgrades, and maintain operational independence. Local production creating 12,600 high-skilled aerospace jobs. Complete control over mission software, weapons integration, and operational systems. No American approval required for modifications. No dependency on US-controlled supply chains. No political exposure when Washington's priorities shift. Industry Minister Melanie Joly emphasized this wasn't about abandoning allies. This was about ensuring defense spending delivered dual benefits. National security plus economic development. The F-35 provided capability, but sent $70 billion to American contractors with minimal Canadian industrial participation. The Gripen provided comparable capability while building Canadian aerospace capacity, creating Canadian jobs, and retaining Canadian sovereignty. Every dollar spent on defense should strengthen Canada militarily and economically. The Gripen accomplished both. The F-35 accomplished only one. Provincial reactions split along economic lines. Ontario aerospace workers supported Saab's manufacturing proposal. Quebec aerospace clusters saw opportunities for technology transfer. British Columbia defense contractors anticipated parts production. The prairies focused on Arctic operational needs. Every province with aerospace industry or Arctic territory recognized that this decision would shape Canadian defense and industrial capacity for 40 years. The F-35 locked Canada into American dependency. The Gripen offered genuine partnership. The mathematical result is simple. Lower acquisition costs plus drastically reduced operating costs plus 12,600 Canadian jobs plus full operational sovereignty plus Arctic optimized design. Canada acknowledged the F-35 offers unmatched stealth and sensor capabilities. But those advantages come packaged with permanent dependency on American-controlled systems, vulnerability to US political decisions, and minimal Canadian industrial benefits. Sweden's proposal survived Pentagon pressure while delivering sovereignty Canada wouldn't compromise. Here's where it gets fascinating. The Pentagon's warnings weren't really about aircraft performance, they were about control. The F-35 operates inside an ecosystem entirely managed by Washington. Mission software updates come from Lockheed Martin and the Pentagon. Weapons integration requires US approval. Sustainment depends on American-controlled supply chains. Operational data flows through US command networks. Modifications need Pentagon authorization. This isn't collaboration. This is architectural dependency designed to ensure that even after purchase, operational authority remains in American hands. Canada buys the aircraft, but doesn't fully own it. That dependency creates strategic vulnerabilities Canada cannot ignore. When US domestic politics become unpredictable, as they demonstrably have under Donald Trump, allies face exposure. What happens when American priorities shift? What happens when tariff threats accompany defense cooperation demands? What happens when alliance obligations get weaponized as political leverage? The F-35's technical superiority becomes meaningless if operational control can be revoked or modified based on Washington's political calculations. The Gripen was designed around the opposite philosophy. Sweden built the aircraft, assuming that centralized command networks would be disrupted early in any conflict, that bases would be attacked, that logistics would be strained, that independence would determine survival. Gripen pilots trained to operate from highways and improvised airstrips. Ground crews can refuel and rearm the jet in under 10 minutes using minimal equipment and small teams. The aircraft operates without massive infrastructure. The philosophy is resilience through autonomy. This creates a fascinating dynamic for Canada's Arctic reality. Canada protects the second largest airspace on Earth. Much of it covers remote northern regions where infrastructure is minimal and weather is brutal. Arctic patrols aren't theoretical exercises. They're operational necessities. Russian bomber flights near Canadian airspace have increased. Polar routes are gaining strategic importance. Response times matter more than perfect performance under ideal conditions. Aircraft must start in extreme cold, travel enormous distances, land on short or damaged runways, and remain functional even when logistics are strained. The Gripen was built for exactly these conditions. Sweden designed it for dispersed operations in harsh environments where centralized support isn't available. It operates from roads. It handles extreme cold naturally. It requires minimal ground support. It maintains high availabilities even when infrastructure degrades. Canadian Arctic bases aren't pristine facilities with unlimited resources. They're remote installations where reliability and simplicity determine whether aircraft can actually fly when needed. Meanwhile, the F-35 reflects different assumptions. It thrives on deep integration, advanced maintenance facilities, constant digital connectivity, and uninterrupted support systems. Its stealth capabilities and the sensor fusion are genuinely unmatched. But they depend on infrastructure that may not exist in Arctic operations or may be targeted first in any conflict. When satellites get jammed, when data links get disrupted, when fuel depots get damaged, dependency becomes catastrophic vulnerability. The F-35 doesn't stop being capable. It stops being available. The US Lumber Coalition keeps claiming interoperability requires American platforms. They're lying. Or they're deliberately conflating integration with dependency to serve Pentagon interests. NATO operates multiple fighter types successfully. Swedish Gripens fly NATO missions alongside F-16S, Eurofighters, and Rafales. Interoperability requires compatible communication systems and coordinated procedures, not identical aircraft controlled by a single nation. Hungary and Czech Republic operate Gripens as full NATO members. Their ability to coordinate with allied forces isn't compromised. What gets compromised is American control over their operational decisions. That's what the Pentagon actually fears, not capability gaps, autonomy. The consequences of Canada's position extend far beyond fighter jet specifications to fundamental questions about alliance architecture and sovereignty. When Ambassador Hoekstra warned that American aircraft would fly more Canadian patrols if Ottawa chose the Gripen, he exposed something Pentagon officials prefer to keep quiet. NORAD already gives both countries authority to cross borders for intercept missions. That system has operated on mutual trust since the Cold War, but Hoekstra's statement reframed border authority as conditional, as something Washington could expand unilaterally if Canada made procurement decisions the Pentagon disapproved of. That's not alliance partnership. That's hierarchical control where sovereignty becomes negotiable based on compliance. This threat carries enormous implications for Canadian Arctic sovereignty. Canada has defended its northern airspace independently for decades, coordinating with American forces when beneficial, but maintaining an ultimate authority over Canadian territory. Hoekstra's warnings suggested that authority could be overridden if Canada chose non-American equipment. American fighters would patrol Canadian Arctic. American decisions would determine response protocols. American command would operate inside Canadian sovereign space. This wasn't about capability gaps. This was about using NORAD structure as leverage to enforce procurement dependency. Canadian defense analysts immediately recognized the danger. If Washington could threaten to increase its military presence inside Canadian territory based on equipment choices, then sovereignty itself becomes conditional. Today it's fighter jets. Tomorrow it's naval platforms, missile defense systems, or intelligence architecture. The precedent would establish that alliance obligations override national authority, that smaller allies must accept American operational control as the price of security cooperation. Canada rejected that framework entirely. Meanwhile, Sweden's Saab proposal delivers tangible economic benefits the F-35 cannot match. Technology transfer to Canadian aerospace firms. manufacturing of major components including airframes, avionics, and weapon systems, final assembly and testing facilities in Canada, research and development partnerships creating 12,600 high-skilled jobs distributed across Ontario aerospace clusters, Quebec aviation industries, British Columbia defense contractors, and prairie technology sectors. These aren't temporary construction positions. These are permanent engineering, manufacturing, and maintenance careers that build Canadian industrial capacity for generations. The National Association of Canadian Defence Industries confirmed that Saab's commitment represents the most comprehensive technology transfer ever offered to Canada by a foreign defence contractor. Canadian engineers would work on cutting-edge aerospace systems. Canadian manufacturers would supply NATO standard components. Canadian facilities would become centers of excellence for cold-weather aviation technology. The economic multiplier effects extend beyond direct employment. Universities would develop research programs. Suppliers would establish specialized capabilities. Canada would build genuine aerospace sovereignty while strengthening defense capabilities. By contrast, the F-35 program concentrates production in the United States with minimal Canadian industrial participation. Some components get manufactured in Canada, but final assembly, advanced systems integration, and ongoing development remain American-controlled. The $70 billion Canada would spend flows primarily to Lockheed Martin and American subcontractors. Canadian industry receives fragments. Canadian sovereignty gets purchased at premium prices without strategic independence. Other NATO members are watching Canada's resistance closely. Finland recently selected the F-35 after intense pressure. Norway made similar choices, but both countries expressed concerns privately about long-term dependency and American political reliability under leaders like Donald Trump. If Canada demonstrates that modern fighters can be operated with full sovereignty retained, other allies will reconsider. Poland, Romania, future NATO members expanding eastward. The precedent Canada sets now will influence alliance procurement politics for decades. This is where Pentagon warnings become most revealing. The issue was never radar cross-section or missile range. It was preventing other allies from recognizing they have alternatives. If Sweden's Gripen proves that NATO interoperability doesn't require American platform dependency, the entire influence architecture shifts. Allies would design procurement around sovereignty rather than integration. They would demand technology transfer and industrial benefits. They would refuse to accept permanent dependency as the cost of modern defense. Washington's leverage would collapse. The irony is perfect. The Pentagon pressured Canada to accept F-35 dependency to maintain alliance cohesion. It created the opposite result. Canada's public refusal to comply demonstrates to every ally that sovereignty can be defended even against American pressure. The more aggressively Washington pushes, the more clearly it reveals that cooperation has become coercion, and the more attractive Sweden's sovereignty-preserving alternative becomes to nations watching Canada resist successfully. The endgame is clear. Canada has permanently redefined what alliance partnership means in the 21st century. Ambassador Hoekstra's warnings about a NORAD restructuring and increased American patrols were designed to create fear. Fear of isolation, fear of abandonment, fear that sovereignty comes with unbearable security costs. But Canada called that bluff. Ottawa made explicit what Pentagon planners desperately wanted to avoid becoming public. Alliance cooperation has become weaponized dependency, and Canada refuses to accept that framework. This refusal is permanent because it's institutionalized in Canada's defense review process. Mark Carney established that procurement decisions will be evaluated on 3 criteria: operational capability for Canadian strategic needs, particularly Arctic sovereignty, economic benefits to Canadian industry and workers, retention of full national control over systems and operations. American preference is not a criterion. Pentagon pressure is not a factor. Alliance politics matter only when they serve Canadian interests, not when they demand Canadian subordination. Canada's reassessment of the F-35 contract isn't a negotiating tactic. It's a fundamental policy shift. For decades, Canada assumed that alliance obligations meant automatic alignment with American defense programs. That assumption is gone. Sweden's Gripen demonstrated that alternatives exist. Modern fighters can be operated with full sovereignty. NATO interoperability doesn't require American platform dependency. Technology transfer can build domestic industrial capacity. Defense spending can strengthen national security and national economy simultaneously. The F-35 model of purchasing capability while surrendering control is no longer the only option. Meanwhile, American defense strategy faces a self-inflicted problem. The Pentagon structured modern fighter programs around centralized control, specifically to create dependency. F-35, F-22, advanced systems all designed so operational authority remains in American hands even after export. That architecture worked when allies had no alternatives and trusted American political stability. Both conditions have collapsed. Sweden offers genuine alternatives. And Donald Trump's presidency demonstrated that American political decisions can become unpredictable, hostile, and threatening even to closest allies. The social and strategic consequences extend across NATO. When Canada publicly resists Pentagon pressure and evaluates the Gripen seriously, other allies notice. Finland, which reluctantly selected the F-35 after intense lobbying, now watches Canada negotiate from sovereignty rather than compliance. Poland, which faces genuine security threats and needs modern air defense, observes that alternatives exist. Future NATO members in the Balkans and Eastern Europe see that alliance membership doesn't require surrendering procurement autonomy. The precedent Canada sets now will reshape alliance politics for generations. This matters because alliance architecture is shifting fundamentally. For 75 years, NATO operated on the assumption that American leadership meant American control. Smaller allies accepted dependency in exchange for security guarantees. But when American leaders like Trump weaponize alliances for political leverage, threaten tariffs against partners, and suggest annexing allied territory, the security guarantee becomes questionable. Dependency without reliable protection is just vulnerability. Canada recognized this earlier than most allies, and Canada is building alternatives faster than Washington expected. Canada's fighter jet decision cracked open a quiet reality inside NATO, where cooperation has blurred into coercion, where technology choices shape political behavior decades after contracts are signed, where sovereignty becomes conditional based on procurement compliance. Canada rejected that entire framework, not through rhetoric, through action, by taking Sweden's Gripen seriously, by demanding industrial benefits, by insisting on operational control, by refusing to accept Pentagon warnings as ultimatums. The Pentagon thought threatening Canada would force compliance. It permanently damaged American credibility instead. Every ally watching this confrontation now knows that Washington will pressure even closest partners to accept dependency. That NORAD can be weaponized as leverage. That alliance obligations get twisted into hierarchical control. Canada exposed these dynamics by refusing to stay silent, by making sovereignty non-negotiable, by demonstrating that alternatives exist and resistance succeeds. Trump and the Pentagon wanted a routine fighter purchase that locked Canada into F-35 dependency for 40 years. They triggered a sovereignty crisis that will reshape NATO procurement politics permanently. They made Canadian defense more independent, not more aligned. They made other allies more skeptical, not more trusting. They made American influence more fragile, not more secure. Canada paid no immediate cost for resistance because the threat was empty. Washington cannot afford to restructure NORAD unilaterally. American forces cannot patrol Canadian Arctic without Canadian cooperation. The Pentagon needs Canada more than Canada needs F-35 dependency. And that reality, now exposed publicly, changes everything. Canada wins, Pentagon loses. And every NATO ally watching learned that sovereignty can be defended successfully even against American pressure. That's the precedent that terrifies Washington, and that's why this fight matters far beyond fighter jets.